I had a person telling me when the last people went, but I'm going to go ahead and get started since it's 6:34. My name is Ann Burns. I'm the current president of the Portsmouth Historical Society. Welcome. Tonight we're presenting a topic that is both seasonally and socially relevant for this time of year. My hope is that you'll learn things that you've never learned before. It's a topic that has not been covered as in depth, I think, as it should be and needs to be. And then maybe at Thanksgiving you can sound really intelligent among all your family and friends. So our speaker tonight is Mr. Stephen Luce. He's on the board of directors here. He grew up in Portsmouth and graduated from Portsmouth High School in 1988. He served on active, I know you're old, he served on active duty in the Army for 4 years, plus 7 years in the Army Reserve. He graduated from the University of Missouri in 1997 with a BA in psychology and a minor in history. He worked for many years in government for the state of Missouri, the city of Newport, and more recently the town of Portsmouth. In 2018, Stephen obtained his MA in history with an archaeology focus at the University of Rhode Island. He's worked on several archaeological digs, including on his property recently, and most recently completed a survey of all the historic cemeteries in Portsmouth, along with discovering and recording several new burial grounds and markers, which we've covered, but go on our website and you can find more about them. He literally discovered a new old colonial graveyard. 2 of them, I think, right? One kind of in Newport. So without, I'm in Portsmouth. So without further ado, I introduce Stephen Luce, discussing Indigenous peoples in Portsmouth during colonial times.
Thank you, and thank you, Anne. First, I would like to acknowledge all of the wonderful work that Anne Burns has done for the Portsmouth Historical Society. As she mentioned, she is the current president, but she will be stepping down from that role. And I'm not sure how we're going to replace her. She is irreplaceable. So really quick, if everyone could give a big applause. All right, so my name is Stephen Luce. As Anne mentioned, she gave a little bio of me. The one thing is I went back to graduate school in 2018 at URI, and I obtained my master's in history in 2021. I wish I had gotten it in 2018 the same time I went in.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. It took a few years to get it. I would like to first say that I'm going to make a few mistakes tonight. So please understand, I am not an Indigenous person myself. I am going to try to impart some information about the history of Indigenous peoples here in Portsmouth during part of the colonial period. My title should probably be something more like Indigenous Peoples Connected to the landmass currently known as Portsmouth within part of the colonial period. But that would be too cumbersome and awkward a title. Also, you can already see my first mistake. I misspelled Narragansett on this slide right here. So that is all me. You're going to see a lot of words that are technically misspelled, and that is just the original spelling from the original records. Most everything I'll be discussing tonight came from colonial records written by the English. A little bit of what I'll be discussing is actually a bit of oral history, some things that have been told to me and people that I know. Now, historians normally only put stock in the written word, written history, but oral history can also be just as valid in many cases as well. Now, a quick overview, a few acknowledgments. I've given one to Anne, a few more acknowledgments. I'd like to thank the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum. I would like to thank Dr. Mac Scott, who is an historian and a Narragansett. And I'd like to thank Lauren Spears, and also anyone and everyone that has helped me along this journey to try to get a little more information about the Indigenous peoples here in Portsmouth. I'm going to go over the historical background of the Narragansett and Wampanoag, including the Great Dying. I'm going to go over a timeline of the Quinnic Island acquisition, talk about Prudence Island, Because when we speak about Portsmouth, Prudence Island and Hog Island quite often get left out. Anyone here from Prudence Island or Hog Island tonight? It must be, it's so tough to get over here, right, from the ferry and such. So there will be some discussion of that. Some of the early legislation, and that's where a lot of this information comes from. The main motivation for me to do this talk tonight was two things. Number one, reading about descriptions about Native Americans here in Portsmouth that don't always shed the most positive light on their circumstances. And then also, the motivation was a lot of people don't seem to know that there was a lot of interactions with the early colonists and the indigenous peoples in the first century of Portsmouth. I'm going to mention Mr. Jim Garman right here. He has said to me a few times over the past couple years that there really weren't any indigenous peoples here in Portsmouth after we acquired the island. But throughout my research through the years, I knew that wasn't the case. There were so many records in the town records, so many mentions. It was something that consumed the local Portsmouth colonists from the very early 1600s all the way beyond King Philip's War and into the 18th century. It was a huge issue, and we're going to be talking about some of that. Talking about Metacom's War. So King Philip's War can also be termed Metacom's War, and I prefer that term simply because by the time the war was initiated, he was no longer wanting to be called Philip. His given name was Metacom, so Metacom's War might be more appropriate. Talk about the indentures of certain Native Americans, including Mi'kmaq and her children, inquests of indigenous deaths, and the trials of Peter Mott and Job Slocum. So just really quick, here, I mean, you don't really have to take this in, but it's just a list of some of the local indigenous names of some of the tribes, some of the places, and some of the people names. Some names that you might be familiar with, such as Antinomy, but many names you may not be familiar with. Pesicus, for example. The reason that these names are up here is that they are all in the records that I'm going to be going over tonight, and they all have a certain connection with Portsmouth. I do want to say that, well, I'm going to get into that a little bit more here in just a minute. My goal here tonight is really just to try to impart, as I say, some information that you may not have already heard. And believe me, as I say, not being an indigenous person, I do not want to offend anyone, and I do hope that you ask lots of questions at the end. And I do also hope that you will have some information to share with me to help me in doing this project in the future. So just a really quick background information. But before I go into that, really quick, terminology that we're using here. So you notice that the title of my presentation is Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, American Indians, Indian. These are all terms that we've heard and used over the years. Which ones are appropriate? They're actually basically all the same. From hearing from local indigenous people, if you're not referring to them by their actual tribal name, then it's really all the same. Native American, indigenous peoples, Indian, it lumps all of them into one category as if they were one group of people. So if you know the actual tribe or nation that someone is from, if they're from the Narragansett, you say Narragansett. If you know they're from the Wampanoag, you say Wampanoag. Also, you can also just ask the person, if you're actually with someone, how they prefer to be addressed. So I'll be using all the terms tonight. I'll be saying Native American, I'll say indigenous people, and I'll even say Indian because, as I say, it's a little complicated. Some people prefer the term, some people don't. The Narragansetts, for example, the official name is Narragansett Indian Tribe. That is still their name. The federal government recognizes the American Indians. That is the term that they use. So going back thousands of years, the ancestors of the current Narragansett and Wampanoag have been living here in this area for thousands of years. But I'm not going to cover all that history. Ranger McNiff did a great job of that last month. So we're going forward and just giving a basic background in the early 1600s. So the two maps I have up here, the one on the left I want to apologize for. That's not your eyes. It is that blurry. That's me taking a very bad picture at the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum. And the reason I wanted to include that map is because that is their historic territory that they have determined through a lot of research. I don't have the information underneath it as you would see if you go to their museum, but based on archaeological research based on the 17th century records, based on the language and where they find their people living, that is the territory on the left that they believe is their historic territory, all the way up from beyond Boston, and yes, including Aquinic Island. Now the map on the right, this was done in the 19th century, and I include this as well as a comparison. The map on the right does not have the Cape Cod as part of Wampanoag territory. I'm not sure why. But the map on the right also includes Prudence Island as part of Wampanoag territory. This is the only map that I've ever seen that. Notice that the Wampanoags themselves did not include Prudence on their map. If you could tell from that blurriness of the different colors, orange. So it just goes to show you a little bit of what was historically their territory that eventually changed. And also, again, a little basic information. So the Wampanoag shelters were called weetus, called wigwams in other cultures. Both of these pictures are from the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum. And the weetu, that looking just like that on the inside and out, is basically exactly what Europeans would have seen all throughout this area 400, 300 years ago. And when you read Roger Williams and his interactions with Native Americans, such as Massasoit Usamakwen, he's not very flattering, neither he or William Bradford, about the conditions of the weetus. He described them as very smoky and very dirty. And it's a dirt floor. And there's a fire pit right in the middle. So I could see that it would be smoky and dirty. But they're also very functional. And most likely, the same type of structures are what the early colonists here would have used until they built their actual homes. As I mentioned to my part earlier, I'm going to be doing a lot of Marco Rubio's drinking during this. Thank you. Also from the Mashpee Wampanoag Museum, dug out canoe. You would see hundreds of these throughout the bay in the 1600s. And the Wampanoag, this is how they made their canoes. They dug them out of old trees. I want to make it clear as best as possible that if you have any questions about any specific indigenous tribe or nation, such as the Wampanoag or the Narragansett or the Pequot, I encourage you to contact them directly. I am not trying to tell their story up here because I really can't tell their story. I am, at the best I can, telling the story of the English colonists and their interactions and what they wrote about the indigenous peoples here. But this type of canoe is the exact same type of canoe that would have, as I say, been used by thousands of Native Americans and hundreds of canoes here in this bay. There are stories about, for example, King Philip Metacomet, taking his canoe as far as Martha's Vineyard. Can you imagine that? A dugout canoe like that all the way to Martha's Vineyard. And because that was part of his people. The Wampanoag and Martha's Vineyard, they had allegiance to his father, to Massasoit. So occasionally he would have to visit the various areas. Roger Williams would have taken a canoe, not necessarily a canoe like this, but took canoes going up and down Narragansett Bay when he came to visit Newport, for example. So a couple of local indigenous leaders that we're going to be talking about some more. On the left, the Massasoit Usamakwen. So we've heard of his name as Massasoit. That's really a title. Massasoit means the great sachem. His name was Usamakwen. So either way, whether you call him Massasoit, we know who we're talking about, or Usamakwen, or Massasoit Usamakwen. He was the father of Metacomet, otherwise known as Philip. Now, neither one of these images are going to be accurate. I personally don't know of any painting done of any indigenous person here in this area at the time. There really should have been. I hope there is one, and hope one of you can tell me about one after this presentation, but I don't know of any. So all of these images are just imaginations by the artist, basically. So Usama Quinn, he is the one who welcomed the Pilgrims in 1620. He is the one who decided to ally his tribe with them. He is the one who helped the Pilgrims survive that first winter. And he was stationed, headquartered at Montauk. So you may have heard of Montauk Golf Course, right? And that was really the name of the village there at what we now call Mount Hope. So Mount Hope is the anglicized version of Montauk. And all the way from that position of power there at Montauk, or Mount Hope, they ruled over their territory, which included Aquidneck Island. It included Aquidneck Island at least until perhaps 1620, if not a little later than that. I'll talk about that here in just a second. About how the Narragansetts acquired the great island of Aquidneck. So this is one of the spellings of Aquidneck that you're going to see as a different spelling that we're used to. It was so interesting to me that I actually started jotting down every single different spelling of Aquidneck that I found. I'm up to about 30 right now. And as I was researching for this talk, I found about 4 or 5 more, but I had to put it to the side. Otherwise, I would have never finished this lecture, these slides. And of course, it's because there was no standardized spelling. Everything was phonetic. However, it sounded to the ears how they wrote it down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because as we look at these records and how these different names and places were written, we get a good idea of really how they were pronounced, because they were written exactly the way the English person heard them spoken. So between roughly 1615 and 1619, there was a series of epidemics that swept through the Wampanoag territory. And it really, unfortunately, did a number. They were, those pandemics were described as miraculous plagues by John Winthrop after they occurred. Because when the English first came here and they saw all of these open fields, they saw all of this land that was ready to be colonized and ready to be worked, they thought it was the providence of God that opened up the land for them. It was, unfortunately, something worse than that. It was something more human, more earthly, which were a matter of diseases. Originally, it was thought to be smallpox, but there are studies now that say that was not the case, and it was perhaps a separate disease. But either way, that particular pandemic, and also in 1632, there was more sickness, really did a number on depleting the Wampanoags. So at about that time, around 1632 or a few years earlier, the weakened and depleted Wampanoag succumbed to the more abundant Narragansett in a series of battles, including the Battle of Aquidneck. So I have been looking for more substantial resources about this Battle of Aquidneck, and it's very difficult. So I'm putting this in the realm of oral history. But this is something I heard years ago when I was a child growing up here. And it's also something I read recently in an 1850 history book, which, as you can imagine, is not very well researched. And that is the Battle of Aquidneck happened around 1620 to 1630 between the Narragansett and the Wampanoag. Because at that time, even though this island belonged to the Wampanoag, they were so depleted and so weakened that they couldn't hold it. So according to the 1850 history I just read a few weeks ago, when I was trying to find a really good source for this, the battle happened 3¼ miles north of the townhouse, Colony House in Newport, just by the West Road in a swampy area. So I actually drove that a couple weeks ago to find out exactly where that would take me. I knew roughly where it would be in Middletown, but I wasn't positive. And it takes you right to basically where Barnes & Noble is, where Michael's is. So behind that shopping center, I know there is a bit of a low, sort of wet, swampy area. I've never been back there myself, but according to at least this history from 1850, that's where this final battle took place, that the Narragansetts were able to defeat the Wampanoag to have full control of the island. Now this, you definitely don't have to read this all, and I do apologize. As I was doing this, I kind of violated one of the rules of presentations, of lectures, which is you're not supposed to put much words on a slide, because once you do, the audience tends to just start reading and not listen to the speaker. Well, I'm hoping that there's so much words up there you won't even bother looking at that, and you'll just kind of listen to me, and I'm basically just going to quickly read up some of them. The point of this is that the acquisition of this island from the Narragansett was not a one-and-done deal. Growing up, this is how I heard this, that we bought the island fairly. We bought it, it was done and over with, and that was it. That wasn't the situation. From the Narragansett's point of view, from Miantinomi and Canonicus' point of view, they were allowing these Englishmen, allowing Coddington and others to settle on the island, because that's what the sachems did. They distributed the use of land, which is their basis of their power. They didn't have power by, basically by conquering in the European sense. They had their authority by helping others, by being the best help, who can help everyone in the village and tribe the best. And they looked at Coddington and the English as just another group of people that might be able to help them. So these things that were paid for the island were just gratuities. And this isn't just my opinion. I'm going to show you a slide in just a second. Roger Williams himself is going to say this very same thing. So, as I say, growing up, I was told that we acquired this island, very much in a fair payment. But what kind of fair payment is this when 40 fathoms of white beads, 10 coats, and 20 hoes, is that really going to pay for this entire island? So the white beads were for Canonicus and Miantinomi, and to be clear, Canonicus was the main sachem of the Narragansett. Miantinomi was his nephew. He was the minor sachem. And the Narragansett always had that setup of two sachems, a major and a minor one. So Coddington in 1637 first came and spoke with Wanamantinomi. I hope I said that right. Wanamantinomi. And you've heard of that golf course as well, too, right? Wanamantinomi. If you go on the Wanamantinomi Golf Course website, it'll say that Wanamantinomi was the governor of this island. It's not really, that's not correct. He was a sachem on this island in the early 1600s. Not the only one, not the sole one, because on the fourth line down you see Wanamatinuit was also a sachem of Aquidneck, and during this transaction in 1637 he received 5 fathoms of wampum. So when Coddington first came to Wanamantinomi, he told Coddington that, no, I'm sorry, I don't have the authority to deal with you with this great island here. You have to go speak with Canonicus and Miantinomi. They are the top sachems of our tribe. And so he did. And Canonicus and Miantinomi were quite on board with this arrangement from their point of view. Again, from their point of view, they're allowing a few English people to live on the island, to work the land, to be allies to them, okay? But from the English point of view, it was a sale, done and over with. Now please get off our island.
Yeah.
So, just really quick on some of the and I just want to point out, so notice all the way down at the very bottom, November 1639, Miantinomi receives 23 coats, 13 hoes, and 2 tar heaps. We have no idea what tar heaps are. Some people think they're hatchets. To distribute to the Indians that did inhabit of the island of Quinnig, and full of all promises, debts, and demands for the said island. So in 1637, if you read that deed, it says, basically payment in full. 2 years later, the English are still trying to say payment in full. After 2 years of giving all of these coats and hose and wampum to all of these sachems and inhabitants, the English are really hoping that by now they have full control of this island. Quick reference, I just want to point out, these are just random things. Some of these are random. A lot of this is going to be in chronological order, and that's what I'm kind of going with, so we're kind of up to 1640 right now. But I'll be going back and forth a little bit as well. So 1640 is a reference regarding the boundary between Portsmouth and Newport, now Middletown, on West Main Road. And I paraphrase it, but this is, when you see the 3 dots, that means that there was text in between, but it's not pertinent to what I'm trying to say. But everything else is straight from the records. So when it says brook to the hunting wigwam, now standing on the highway between the 2 towns, the bounds between the 2 towns. So after Coddington and some people went south to Newport, to found Newport, a year later, 1640, Newport and Portsmouth had to decide where the boundary was going to be. So the boundary started, it's exactly where it is now between Portsmouth and Newport. So it started on the southeast side, and then it went northwest to West Main Road, basically where Prescott Farm is right now. So what I'm trying to point out right here is that right at West Main Road, where Prescott Farm is right now, there was a hunting wigwam in 1640. Not sure what that was about and how long that hunting wigwam was there, and whether it was something that just the Narragansetts used or the English as well. So this is Roger Williams, and Roger Williams said this a couple times, not just in June 1638, but he said it years later as well. This is what Roger Williams said to John Winthrop. Sir, concerning the islands of Prudence and Aquidneck, neither of them was sold properly, for 1,000 fathom would not have bought either by strangers. The truth is, not a penny was demanded for either, and what was paid was only gratuity, though I chose for better assurance and form to call it sale. So Roger Williams knew that he and Coddington didn't really buy this island. He knew that it was just a gift from Canonicus and Antinomy. But, so the English had it in their mind that it was their island. For better form and assurance, he called it a sale. So now I'm thinking, I don't know about you, so when Anne Hutchinson and Coddington and them came, they thought they were coming to an island that they owned outright. But the Native Americans had a different idea of that, and Roger Williams even knew it was different than that. So that started months and years of conflict between the indigenous peoples of this area and the colonists here in Portsmouth. You may think, like I thought when I was younger, that 1620 to 1675, everything was happy and peace between the colonists and the Native Americans. It wasn't until that belligerent King Philip started a war, it's his war, right, that things went south. It's not the case. There was friction all the way through, and it just kept building and building and building. So just a little quick, stepping back and talking about Prudence Island. Chipakawisa, maybe? I don't know. I'm trying my best. So the Native American name for Prudence Island, Chipakawisa. Now, Canonicus and Antinomy originally gave Chipakawisa to Mr. Oldham on the condition that he moved there. Having failed this, they gave the same deal to Roger Williams. Williams accepted half the island, with the other half reserved for John Winthrop. Though Roger Williams expressed a desire to build a home and live there, it does not appear that he ever did. So this is interesting because it shows again how the Native Americans were trying to assist the English and trying to ally themselves with the English, trying to befriend them by giving them land with the promise that they move to the land and work the land and use the land and be part of their community. There is Dr. Max Scott, the Narragansett, who's a historian, has a PhD in history, who I got some of this information from. I'm paraphrasing what he said to me. Basically what he said was, prior to 1675, that's Metacom's War, the English were living in a Narragansett nation. After 1675, the Narragansett were living in an English colony. Yet still, before we go to that, so here on Prudence Island is something called Pulpit Rock. On this rock, Roger Williams preached to the Indian inhabitants of Prudence Island. I've been to Prudence Island a couple times. I did not know this rock was there. I have never seen it. I don't know if Roger Williams actually preached there as this says, but he may have. Not sure on the full history of that, but want to include it because I want to include as much as possible the pertinent information regarding Indigenous peoples with their connection to Portsmouth. And this is a very bad picture. Cleft rock, a curious array of stone on Prudence Island. So according to this local Prudence Island gentleman from early 20th century, around 1910, he believes that this rock is where Miantonomi and Canonicus had their seat on Prudence Island. It's interesting reading the article that this newspaper is from because it also mentions that every historian around the block was finding Miantonomi and Canonicus seat on every rock, everywhere on every island. Oh, here's a big rock. Must be where he held court and sat. Now, I wouldn't doubt that Canonicus and Miantonomi had a special place that they would want to be to hold their court on every island that was part of their territory. Here on Aquidneck Island, we have Miantonomi Hill that we say that that's where Miantonomi had held his seat. So this probably could very well be where they were. It's an interesting looking rock, and I'd really like to see it in person because it looks like there's an arch there. It looks like two large standing stones with an arch in between them. So I wonder if it's still there. Also on Prudence Island, we have the Old Indian Spring. Now, I don't know if this is still there as well. This picture is from a postcard from over 100 years old. And of course, the Native Americans would not have had this concrete structure the way you see it. So this would have been the colonists just using the spring area. But still, it's a bit of a connection with the old Chipakawisa. Now here is one that I really tried to paraphrase for everybody. So this is fun. So this is some of the things that the Portsmouth officials were saying to the Native Americans. No fires on the island. No traps. Do not kill any boar. Now I'm paraphrasing, but I encourage you all to read these records. It's so fun and so interesting, and they use such colorful language. Do not take or destroy deer or cattle. Do not be unruly. Do not take any canoe, Englishmen's canoes. Do not break any contracts. Do not loiter. Do not come to our homes. Do not fall any trees upon the islands. What can I do? Do not peel any trees upon the islands. What that refers to is peeling the bark off the trees to use the bark for their weetus and wigwams. Do not trade or barter with the French or Dutch. Do not skulk about the island. I love that one there. It basically says, if there are any Indians skulking in the woods, if you find any Indians skulking about in the woods looking suspicious, you can grab them and bring them and detain them. Do not sell, give, deliver, or any other way convey any powder, shotgun, pistol, sword, or any other engine of war to the Indians. So that last one was for the English colonists. And roughly these were between 1640 and 1647. It didn't get any better after that. And several of these were repeated several times over the next 30, 40 years. For example, the prohibition about having weapons, for example, the penalties just increased each time they wrote them down again. Now this is a fun one I like, only because of the great controversy we have now with the coyotes on the island. So this island, like all of North America, was filled with wolves for thousands of years. Wolves had no natural predator. Wolves hate coyotes. The wolves would keep the coyotes sequestered in the southwest. You remember from Bugs Bunny the Roadrunner, the coyotes belong in the southwest, and that's where they were for thousands of years. But when Europeans came to the land, they killed and got rid of the wolves, because wolves and European settlement do not go along very well. Wolves will eat the crops, so basically they'll attack the domesticated animals, and they also will scare and hurt and sometimes even kill young children or older people. So the English first asked the Native Americans in 1642. Roger Williams was given authority to consult and agree with Antinomy, sachem of Narragansett, for the destruction of the wolves that are now upon the island. But in no way does this allow you to also kill deer. So I'm paraphrasing what the law actually said. But it's just interesting how they made sure they went out of their way to say, oh yeah, remember we told you you can't kill any deer? You still can't kill any deer. Come on the island and kill the wolves, but that's it, no deer. And so now we have an island full of coyotes because there are no wolves to keep them away. Now I'm mentioning what happened to Anne Hutchinson, because Anne Hutchinson, of course, is a great connection to Portsmouth. As you all know, she is considered the first woman to found a town here in America. She did not sign the Portsmouth Compact, being a woman. Her husband, William, did. But in 1641 or 2, and most of her children moved out to New Netherland, which was controlled by the Dutch at the time. She had to get farther away from John Winthrop because she kept fearing that she would be persecuted even more than she had been. She had a lot of children. Anne Hutchinson had 15 children. Now by this time, I think 1 or 2 were already adults. I believe 12 or 13 of the children, I don't even want to imagine a number. I don't want to guess at the number. She definitely had 15 children. Not all 15 were in New Netherlands at this time of this attack. So William Kieft was the leader of New Netherland, and he ordered an attack against the Lenape without approval from his council and without approval of the Dutch colonists. The Sewanee allied themselves with the Lenape after this attack, and they counterattacked. And Anne Hutchinson and most of her family were killed as a result. I say most of her family because her husband, William, had already died and was buried here in Portsmouth. Oldest son didn't go with her. But during this attack, one daughter, Susanna, was out picking berries. And Susanna, she survived the initial attack. And then when the Sewanee warriors found her, they did not kill her. They kidnapped her. It's guessed that maybe they did not kill her because she was a redhead, and they might have seen that as a positive omen, perhaps. But they did not kill her. The reason I have the words alarm there is because in our Portsmouth records, we did it first, I believe in 1639, that Newport did it in 1640. They have to go ahead and deal with any possible incursion on the island. So if there was ever any possibility of something happening, the French are attacking or the Native Americans are coming across to attack, they would have the designated person run throughout the town yelling, "Alarm! Alarm!" and beating a drum incessantly after firing 3 separate musket shots. Now, it takes a couple minutes to fire each musket shot, so I can't imagine this was a very quick, efficient way to get people to realize that there's an attack. But I just thought that was quite interesting. That's the way they did it. They certainly had to, right? They didn't have any other means. They didn't have any bullhorns. They didn't have any phones, so nothing more than people running around yelling alarm. Now, a few little bits of information from the records. And I have these here just to show how things are changing. So we're going from a majority indigenous population, thousands of indigenous people, and just a handful of English. And gradually that completely changes within 50, 60 years. And I'll show you later, by 1680, there were about 70,000 English in New England and only 7,000 Native Americans. And those figures were completely reversed, a few decades before that. So this is just showing some of those changes. So in March of 1644, after just 6 years after Portsmouth was founded, Usamakwen, that's Massasoit Usamakwen, was given permission with 10 men to kill 10 deer, only within the liberty of Portsmouth. And the deer had to be brought to town so Mr. Brent and Mr. Bolston could view them. I guess they didn't trust Usamakwen, the great Massasoit himself, who helped them get this island, who helped the Pilgrims for years. They wanted to make sure that they only took, the 10 deer that they were authorized, and then to depart from the island within 5 days. So it was very nice of the colonists, on the one hand, to even allow this, but still, it's just odd. It's odd in a couple reasons, reasons why. Were there no longer any deer around Montauk? By this time, perhaps things were already getting squeezed a little bit. There was already some pressure. For him to have to ask, almost with hat in hand, asking the Portsmouth town officials, hey, is it okay if we get a few deer from Portsmouth? It just shows how the relationship is changing. And the fact that the Portsmouth officials felt it necessary to actually write this down as an act, as an order, as a law, instead of just saying, yeah, sure, go ahead. But no, everything had to be to the letter. The very next month, which is a very interesting and a very sad event, April 1644, this act indeed of the voluntary and free submission of the chief sachem and the rest of the princes with the whole people of the Narragansetts unto the government protection of that honorable state of Old England, signed by Pesicus, Canonicus, and Mixon. So this is when the Narragansetts allegedly, voluntarily, completely gave up their sovereignty to the English and submitted themselves under the rule of King of England. From the English point of view, that's exactly what they did. And that's why everything that happens after this, every infraction that a Native American, indigenous person commits, the English saw that as they had the right to impose their laws, their judgments. It's like, oh, don't you remember? You submitted yourself to the English authority back in 1644. Now, if you actually read the full contents of this, there's so much legalese in there, and we're going to have trouble, making sense of it today. I mean, how do you think with a different language, with people who were not familiar with these terms or our language, actually understood about this? A few months later, it's ordered that all the Indians in the town of Portsmouth, so just about everything I'm going to be talking about here is dealing with Portsmouth. That's the whole point of this lecture. But some of the items happen for the entire island. Some things are applied to the entire island, which at this time was just Newport and Portsmouth. So in the town, all the Indians in the town shall depart forthwith to live in the woods with their effects. If they appear again, they shall forfeit. And it goes on to say what they're going to forfeit. So a couple things about this. Do you remember from that slide, in 1639, Miantinomi was given some hose and such for the inhabitants to leave the island? He was given some wampum a year or two before that for his pain and travels in getting the Indians off the island. Apparently, they're not off the island. So they never were at this time. As much as the English had hoped that they would have been off the island, they never were. And it shows up in all of these laws. You have to understand, these laws were created not in a vacuum. They were created because of a need. If there were no Indians on the island, there would be no need to have a law that says they need to get out of town and go live in the woods. And on to 1650, it's ordered that Pesicus shall have liberty to get so many chestnut. I don't know this word, but this is exactly from the record Rhines, by ENS, upon the common of the island, as may cover him a wigwam, provided he take John Green with him, that no wrong may be done to any particular person upon the island. So again, now Pesicus at this time is the Narragansett sachem. He is the leader of the Narragansett, and from his point of view, these English are his people living in his territory. And he probably never even saw this act. He just went and said, hey, I need to get some chestnut bark for a wigwam. Okay. But we're going to write it down, and we're going to make sure we keep an eye on you as well. So, again, it just shows the change in the relationship from one group of people in charge to the new group. And just the very last one on that, this is a good one because this keeps coming up. So May 1667 ordered that the Indians residing upon the island shall be forthwith disarmed of all sorts of arms. Now this is a gun person's worst nightmare here in America. The authorities are literally coming to take away your armaments. And this wasn't the first time, was it? We saw those other acts from the 1640s that says, do not sell or convey in any way any pistols or shots to these Indians. And here we are 20 years later, and it is still an issue. And it continues to be an issue. Now this, as I said, I'm going to read this, and you can listen, or you can read along with me. This was written by Samuel Gorton, 1652. It is the first anti-slavery law in America. At the time, Sam Gorton, also a resident of Portsmouth originally, not originally, but at one time. Sam is such a fantastic character. I encourage all of you to learn about Sam Gorton because he has such a fascinating life. And he was always getting in trouble with the authorities. Here in Portsmouth, we had him whipped and kicked out of town. Anyways, he ended up fairly well. He ended up being president of Providence and Warwick for a year. So the law states, whereas there is a common course practiced amongst Englishmen to buy enslaved Africans, to the end that they may have them for service or slaves forever, for the preventing of such practices among us, let it be ordered that no black mankind or white, being forced by covenant bond or otherwise, to serve any man or as assigned longer than 10 years, or until they come to be 24 years of age, if they be taken in under 14, from the time of their coming within the liberties of this colony. This is going to be important later, too. I hope you're taking notes. There's going to be a big quiz on this at the end. So no more than 10 years of servitude in general, or more than 10 years if they are placed before the age of 14. And at the end or term of 10 years, to set them free as the manner is with the English servants. And that man that will not let them go free, or shall sell them away elsewhere to that end that they may be enslaved to others for a long time, he or they shall forfeit to the colony 40 pounds. That is a hefty fine back then. It's been often said that this law was not followed. We know that Newport was the largest, or one of the largest slave ports during colonial times, especially in the 18th century. So at some point in the 18th century, I would say this law was definitely ignored and no longer followed. But from the research and from a few other things I'm going to show you here, I believe it was followed, at least for a few decades, at least in the 17th century. For example, 11 years later, on August 1st, 1663, Gabriel Jennings was indentured to William Wodell for 14 years and 2 months by his parents. At the end of his term, he was promised 2 suits of apparel, 1 cow, and 1 mare foal weanable. However, if the said Gabriel should be taken away by death within 2 years of the end of his term, then Mr. Wardell will deliver a cow or a mare foal. So William Wardell from Portsmouth, he was a weaver based on one source I've seen. He is going to obtain and acquire and buy many people over the next couple decades. But he starts out with English, because at this time, that's basically all there is. After the Pequot War of 1637, many of the Pequot were enslaved, but not here in Rhode Island, because Rhode Island did not take part in the Pequot War. So during the 1630s and 40s and 1650s, I don't know offhand of any Native Americans that were enslaved or indentured. It's just not even something that I think would have come up. So at this time, if you need help, if you're going to get someone who's indentured, it's going to be an English person. And the process of being indentured, it's a common practice. It was a common practice among the English at this time. And it's definitely different from what's called chattel slavery, much different. When practiced like this, when practiced like it was practiced with Gabriel Jennings, he knew what he was getting into. His indenture, well, to be fair, he was probably only 9 years and 10 months old at this time. So he really, couldn't commit to this, but both of his parents did. And as I say, it was pretty normal back then to do that. The reason to do it is you're a bit of a poor family, you want an opportunity for your child, and so you indenture your child to someone who can raise them, who can feed them and shelter them and clothe them and help them learn a trade. And then at the end of that term, they'll even have something substantial, whether it be money or a cow or some new clothes. But we're going to see a little bit later that that didn't quite apply to non-English. So before we get there, though, really quick, talking about, I had to throw in Hog Island a little bit. So Hog Island was acquired by Portsmouth from Wamsutta in 1654. Wamsutta was the oldest son of Massasoit Usamakwen. Wamsutta took over the sachemship after his father Massasoit died in 1660, I believe. But he was only sachem for 1 year. Wamsutta, also known as Alexander, died after just a year, and Philip Metacom thought he was poisoned. Not really sure. Those names really quick, let me just mention those. So it was not meant in a derogatory way. Calling Philip or Wamsutta Alexander was not meant in any way other than absolute respect. Massasoit asked the English for English names for his sons. What are some good English names that I can give my two oldest sons? And I'm not positive offhand. I believe it was William Bradford who provided the names. Alexander for Alexander the Great, and Philip for Philip of Macedon. Philip was the father of Alexander the Great. So that's where those names come from. Now, William Ballston, John Porter, and John Briggs were chosen and authorized to dispute with any opposers to maintain the town's right in Hog Island. So that seems to be a whole story in and of itself, that there was much dispute as to who really controlled or owned Hog Island for a number of years. And it necessitated the creation of this law, 1657, so that Portsmouth could defend their rights to it. Now, a little bit after that, and this is why I put this beginning of Hog Island with this little statement on the left. So this I find very fun. Where I worked in Portsmouth was in the town clerk's office. So it would have been my responsibility to type up this letter. This isn't the actual letter, this is the order for the letter. So Philip, sachem of Mount Hope, hath put several swine on Hog Island, therein intruding on the rights of this town. It is ordered that a letter shall be drawn up by the town clerk to forewarn the said Philip from any further proceeds in that nature, and also forthwith to remove such swine or other cattle he hath put on the said island. So, you know how close Hog Island is to Bristol, to Montauk. I mean, this is Philip's backyard. All the colonists were doing this. This is why the island got its name, Hog Island. This is what you did. You brought your hogs and goats to Goat Island, Newport. You brought your hogs to Hog Island here because you wanted them to be away from your crops. You wanted them to be quarantined in some area on a small island. They are, and they could just run free. You mark your hogs, your swine in the ear with your specific mark, and only the English were allowed to do that. The Native Americans were told specifically they couldn't do that. That was a whole catch-22 situation with the hogs. And we could talk so long about this, but in general, everything was being taken away from them. if I can no longer hunt deer because there aren't any deer, or because they're on your land and you don't want me going on your land, what can I do? I will buy some of your hogs and swine. You know, we brought hogs over here. Hogs are not native to this land. But the Native Americans love them. Why wouldn't they? Whoever loves bacon, you can understand. It's a very tasty thing. So Philip was not doing anything different than the English were doing. The problem was he wasn't English. And this is what caused this letter to be sent. We don't know what happened. This is the order for the letter. The letter was drawn up by the town clerk and was sent to him. I also wonder how the postage ran back then. You know, you get on the ferry there, you know, where the bridge is now, and you take the boat over to Montauk, and I don't know, you just walk into the village and just say, this is for Philip. But yeah, we don't know the results. Since there was no other act mentioned after this, it's likely Philip complied and took the hogs off the island. So as of 1675, roughly, this would be the nature of the territories. So here in the lower right, in the green, is the Wampanoag. And that kind of orange color would be the English colony of Plymouth. Above that would be the English colony of Massachusetts. And that here is our little colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, in that very light kind of white color, with the Narragansetts to the west and the Nipmuc up in the northwest. So as Metacom's War was breaking out, this is roughly what the territories look like. All right. I did a couple years ago in college an entire lecture on King Philip's War, Metacom's War. So you're not going to get all that tonight, but you're going to get this little bit of a summary here. So Metacom may have negotiated a truce with the leaders of Portsmouth during the war, or before the war, since there were many pacifists from the Society of Friends / Quakers, and Philip had more grievance with the mainland English. I say many Quakers. There probably weren't many Quakers as of 1675. The first ones came over here in the 1660s. But they did grow very rapidly here in Portsmouth, and they were complete pacifists. To be a true Quaker, a true Society of Friends, you do not have American flags or Christian flags on your church, because you should respect the actual substance of what those things represent rather than the symbol. And you don't enslave people, and you don't kill people. So it's very possible that Philip did speak with the Portsmouth leaders at some point to sort of come to a mutual neutrality between the two. But regardless, no attacks occurred on Aquidneck Island during the 14 months of Metacom's War. The 14 months of Metacom's War was from June 1675 to August 1676 here in southern New England. The war continued for at least 2 more years up north, very violently with the Abenaki up in Maine and such. So the war was throughout New England, and it did continue even beyond Metacom's death. The island, Aquidneck Island here, became a refuge actually for those English fleeing Providence and other attacked towns. Providence was burned, as Mr. Zillian can attest to. He wrote a good article about that. And many of the refugees from Providence came here to the island. Benjamin Church and others from the Great Swamp Massacre actually recovered from their wounds here in Newport. After Benjamin Church and the other English finished their killings of hundreds of women and children and a few warriors, it was cold. They could have very easily stayed in the Narragansett Fort at the Great Swamp, and they would have stayed warm, but they refused to stay in these Native Americans' filthy, wigwams. And so they braved the freezing cold from basically where URI is now to Wickford. And many of their wounded actually died along the way, unnecessarily. But those that did survive that came over here to Newport, specifically to Newport, to recover from those wounds. So August of 1671, just give you a little bit of a timeline. And these are all, as I said, I'm trying to connect all of these here with Portsmouth. So Council of War from both, and specifically the references, the town councils of Newport and Portsmouth and the councils of war of Newport and Portsmouth, both. They met at George Lawton's house right here in Portsmouth, right by the Lawton Cemetery, by the reservoir, on the little section of Old West Main Road between the reservoir and the new West Main. So they met there to secure, to find out the best ways for securing the inhabitants and their estates in these times of imminent danger. So 1671, imminent danger. Metacom's War didn't start for another 4 years, but already imminent danger. But this imminent danger had been going on for years, from the 1660s, when the English were disarming the Native Americans. So this had just been building and building and building. It's like a powder keg. April 1675, boats were ordered to patrol the bay for island defense, with a third of the men from Portsmouth. So they started out with at least 4 boats. Now, I don't know how well, 4 boats that contain at least 5 men each, 5 to 6 men each. So 24 men in 4 boats patrolling around Aquidneck Island. This is a big island. If you ever been in a boat to try to go around it or even drive around it. Within this legislation, it says if you need more, by all means, go ahead and get more, but start out with 4 boats. So I'm not sure how effective that was. Perhaps at the end of the war, they patted themselves on the back because there were no incursions. There was no invasion by the Native Americans. But honestly, they had their hands full with attacking the mainland towns. There were so many mainland towns to attack. And if the people of Portsmouth were willing to stay neutral and not attack them, there you go. March 1676, the inhabitants here in Portsmouth are ordered to sell and send their Indian men and women from this town. So before this, they weren't even supposed to have any, yet they're still here. It's very confusing. It's not so confusing. We know, the point is that they never went away. They were always here on the island throughout all of this. And that's also one of the main things I need to mention right now that perhaps I should have mentioned in the beginning. I'll mention it toward the end, which is they are still here. That's one of the things that each Indigenous person I've spoken with, when I asked if there's one thing you would want me to make sure I tell people, what is that? That we're still here. They never went away. Their numbers may have dwindled and gone down, but they're still here, of each tribe, the Narragansett, the Wampanoag, and even other tribes that aren't officially recognized. This one I always found very interesting. April 1676, 100 acres in Portsmouth was set aside for refugees from the mainland, mostly from Providence, I believe. So that was just something to, help them out. Portsmouth had this influx of, hundreds of people coming, escaping the terrors of Metacom's War, and they needed a place to live. They needed land to till. They needed to be able to grow their own food. So that specific order was for 2 years to till the land. August 1676, so we come to the end of King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, here in southern New England. Benjamin Church and others ride north from Newport. They are led to Philip by a disgruntled warrior, and then John Alderman shoots Philip. So Benjamin Church was recovering in Newport from his wounds, and a disgruntled warrior, Philip, came to the island. The reason he was disgruntled is pretty understandable. He went to Philip Metacom and said, please, you should sue for peace. I'm sorry. His brother went to Philip, went to Metacom and asked Metacom to sue for peace. Metacom killed him. So now the brother of the one Metacom killed is now understandably upset with Metacom. You just killed my brother just because he asked you to sue for peace. So that brother now turned on Metacom, came over. First he came to the ferry area, and basically, I don't know what they do. They throw up a signal, "Hi, can I come over?" So he's on the Bristol side, he's on Montauk side, asking to come over to the island. He was allowed to come over. He had to go see Benjamin Church in Newport, goes to Newport, and he tells Benjamin, "I know where Philip is, and I can lead you right to him." So Philip said, "Okay, let's go." Benjamin Church said, "Okay, let's go." Benjamin Church is considered America's first ranger, actually, because Benjamin Church actually used many of the fighting tactics, the guerrilla tactics that the Native Americans used. So he used their own tactics against them to help defeat them in a lot of these battles. So Benjamin Church, a couple dozen of English soldiers, along with this disgruntled warrior, and John Alderman. They traveled north from Newport, so they go through Portsmouth, across the ferry into Montauk. Now, John Alderman was a Native American who was originally, I believe, a Pecasset with Weedham. But then he switched sides to the English. So there was a prophecy that Metacom was told many years before this that he would never be killed by an Englishman. And that prophecy came true, because John Alderman, the Native American, is the one that actually shot Metacom in August 1676. Metacom was drawn and quartered. There were various stories as to what happened to his head. One story that John Alderman had his head. Another story, the head was sent to Plymouth and put on a spike, where it remained for many, many years. And John Alderman, it was said, had one of Metacom's hands and kept it in a jar and charged people a fee to have a look at it. Very gruesome, but you hear of similar things throughout the Old West. Clearly it's a practice that happened. Why, yes?
One of my ancestors during this war is supposed to have been beheaded, and his head was put up on a stake outside of the local Native American village.
Yes, the savagery and atrocities were on both sides quite much. And it was all about revenge on both sides. You hurt me, and I hurt you. You attack my friends over here like they did in New Netherlands. Now we're going to attack your colony. Absolutely. Now, as I say, the war here in southern New England was over in 1676, and just a little figure I mentioned earlier, by 1680, there were 68,000 English living in New England and only 7,000 Indigenous. Now, this is a connection with Metacom's war, and there's a connection with Portsmouth and here at the Portsmouth Historical Society. So this is the headstone for Susanna Eldred, in storage right downstairs, right beneath us. She died December 1675 here in Portsmouth, age 14 months. Her family was from North Kingstown, and so the theory, the opinion, is that her family left North Kingstown during Metacom's war for safety reasons and came here to Portsmouth. And so that's why they were here, even though they're from North Kingstown. So Susanna Eldred was the great-granddaughter of Anne Hutchinson. She's the granddaughter of Susanna Hutchinson, the only survivor from that August 1643 attack. So I find that fascinating. That I wish we knew where she was buried so we could put her stone back, but at the very least we do have her headstone downstairs. And that's that connection there. So yes, because of Susanna surviving that attack, she was eventually ransomed back to the English. I don't recall who she was exchanged with. All right. How much longer do you think we should talk? You guys okay for 10 more minutes? Take it to 8 o'clock? All right. Yeah, we started a little bit late, right? All right, so perpetual slavery for Hannah, an Indian woman, that she was willing to enter into. So here we go, from this same William Wardell, who you remember earlier, gave Gabriel Jennings a really good deal. Here's what he does for Hannah. After Hannah was sold by Adam, well, she was sold by Adam to William because she was taken captive in Metacom's War. Actually, a bill of sale was given that was signed and sealed by Benjamin Church himself. But here's, to me, the most interesting thing. After she was... So you remember the 1652 law by Sam Gorton. You cannot be enslaved perpetually forever. Only 10 years, right? If you're over 14 years old, 10 years at the most. The way that law was written, if you recall, is you can't be forced to do that. The English can't. But if you willingly do it, it's okay. So a year after this sale of Hannah to William Wardell, the weaver here in Portsmouth, someone must have noticed that discrepancy that, wait a minute, this, you can't enslave someone perpetually forever. So a year later, in 1678, they had Hannah sign where they wrote, the above named Indian woman doth hereby declare that she is willing to be servant to the above named William Wardell in manner and form above, meaning forever. Now this is also the woman who most likely was brought to William Wardell by John Alderman. So in a way, from John Alderman's point of view, he was helping her. He was helping her escape a worse fate. I guess Adam Wright of Duxbury would not have been a good master for her to be enslaved to. So John Alderman actually helped bring Hannah to William Wardell, perhaps because it was a better circumstance than being with that Adam Wright of Duxbury. We're almost done here, actually. Kind of. Now, April 27, 1678, Portsmouth officials disposed of 3 Pecassid Wampanoags. At the end of their terms, they were given freedom from their servitude, but nothing else. So that's just the biggest thing I want to point out to you right here, is that whereas Gabriel Jennings received the cow and the 2 suits and the mare, all Weequapew got for her 3-year indenture was her freedom. All her 15-year-old daughter, Hannah, all her 6-year-old daughter, Hannah, received after 15 years of indenture was her freedom. The only thing 14-year-old Peter received after his 10 years indenture, what was it? His freedom. That's it. If you can imagine working with someone for 10, 15 years, and at the end of that time, you have nothing. You're not given any clothes. You're not given a cow. So what options do you have other than maybe voluntarily indenture yourself again for another 10 years? Now these years, 10 years and 15 years for Hannah, because she was only 6 years old, these conform to that 1652 law. No more than 10 years if you're over 14. There's Peter. And as long as you want, up to age 24 if you're under 14. Just to throw out another one here to see that this continued on, and it wasn't just William as well. So to show you that it wasn't just William not willing to give anything to his Native American indentures, and that it continued beyond, 1670s. Here's Indian Sam, who also, just one little quote I took from his indenture, shall not by night or by day absent himself from his said master's services. It's interesting the little things that were written in there that they had to make sure they did or didn't do. But the same thing, after the end of he was granted his freedom and nothing else. Now his was only 1 year. Yes, free from servitude. So 1 year, not so bad, but still got nothing after that 1 year other than his freedom. Indigenous labor. After Metacom's War, many of the surviving indigenous people became economically dependent on the colonists. Additionally, indigenous people were imported into New England from Spanish colonies, especially in the early 18th century. That's right, there were no longer even enough, native people here to enslave or indenture. In 1748, there were 807 whites, 134 Negroes, and 51 Indians living in Portsmouth. And again, these are words straight from the historical records. And that is over 5% of the population, 51. I don't know if you can imagine that today. If there was over 5% Native American here in Portsmouth, that's almost 1,000 people, 900 people. That would be quite amazing. Because unfortunately, as of right now, as far as we know, there are not any Indigenous people living in Portsmouth. I wouldn't be surprised if there are, a few at least, but as of the 2020 census, whoever lived in Portsmouth in 2020 filled out that census. None of them, no one mentioned that they were of Indigenous heritage. In 1774, 54% of all Indigenous peoples in Rhode Island were living with a white family. That means half the people, not including those at the reservation near Charlestown, so half of the Indigenous people in Rhode Island were in some way indentured or fully enslaved. In Portsmouth alone, 100% of the 21 Native Americans lived in a white household, which it's very telling. If you look at all these other towns, you'll see Newport, maybe 80% are living in a white household, but 20% are living on their own, and other towns as well. Portsmouth is one of the few that, oh no, if you're an Indian, you cannot be living here on your own. You must be in a white household. Really quick with these three maps. The 1651 Dutch map on the left. I throw it up here just to show that even as of 1651 on Rhode Island, it was recognized that the Narragansetts lived here, or that this was Narragansett land. Nahekans, that's, I guess, how you say Narragansett in Dutch. But by 1675, it's very hard to see, but it says Poconoke country on top. It says King Philip's country right there. So as of 1675, the start of the war, that's still Poconoke territory. But by 1690, those names are gone. This now says Mount Hope, and no mention of Narragansetts on the island. So just kind of show how quickly that progressed. Now this, I am actually just going to go through, I'm going to skip over this here, the Grand Inquest into Indigenous deaths, just to show that there were so many more connections with Portsmouth officials, with Portsmouth residents, and Indigenous peoples. They created inquests every time someone died in the town, and we didn't know how they died. And these men, and it's so official, very lengthy writing, a dozen men would be involved, and they would go and view the body. This is 350 years ago. They didn't know how these people died. If you couldn't see an actual gunshot or stab, they always guessed that they drowned, basically. If an Indigenous person was found by the water, they drowned. If there is any indication that that person had any alcohol at some point during that day, they were drunk and drowned. So I'm just going to skip over that now. All right, now we're on our last 5 to 10 minutes, I promise. So this also was one of the impetus for me to kind of do this presentation today. So this is the story, really quick, of the Indian servant that belonged to Mr. Giles Slocum. His name was Job, and he wrote his name J-O-B-E, so the Indian servant was Job. And here is what the Boston News Leader wrote about this incident. On June 27, 1712, an Indian servant man belonging to Mr. Giles Slocum of Portsmouth carried out to sea in a canoe 2 of his master's sons, one of 10, the other of 9 years old, whom he killed and drowned. And being examined before the authority, I love examined before the authority. I wonder how the authority examined this Indian to get him to what comes after that. After being examined, confessed that he knocked the eldest child in the head with a paddle, and seeing the younger crying, he designedly, intentionally, overset the canoe and swam ashore himself. He's now in irons in prison till he is tried for his murder. So this is what the media is saying about this incident. I wonder where they got this information from. They didn't get it from Job. Job's in prison at this time. Job can't tell his story. If Job really confessed to this murder, then why did he plead not guilty? I don't have it in front of you, but I can certainly show it to you. He pled not guilty. And he then, because of that, went to trial. Now at trial, he was found guilty. I'll throw this in here. I'm telling you, I think there's only one more after this. The Narragansett and the Warwick Indians, this is a quote from Mr. Gookin in 1792, are an active, laborious, and ingenious people, which is demonstrated in the labors they do for the English, especially in making stone fences. My grandmother was right. So when I was a kid, I asked my grandma, where did all these stone walls come from? She said, the Indians built them. Now, growing up, I learned, no, that wasn't true at all. All these stone walls are from the colonists who, when they plowed the fields and they had to do something with the stones, they put them on the walls. Well, it could very well be that a lot of the stone walls here in Portsmouth were built by some of these Native Americans, but they were indentured or servants or enslaved at the time. And this is the final slide. It's just a few random quotes that just show some of the thoughts and feelings of some of the English toward them at the time. So direct from our 1663 Rhode Island Charter, poor, ignorant Indian natives invade and destroy the native Indians. Granted, it's out of context, but that's all right. These are still the exact words from that. For the terror of evildoers hereafter, that was from the Peter Mott case. And the Indians are gone, which is what our Newport Historic Society said in 1912. But Max Scott, just last week, told me, no, we are still here. And that is it. Okay, quick questions and answers. You have a question?
Yeah, the punishment of him around the town. In England, they had an annual punishment, and it was for boys, typically. It was called beating the bounds.
All right.
And they would take people who deserved to be punished, and you would go to certain points on the bounds of your town, like London, and they would be beaten at each one of those places.
Okay.
Later, it turned into a more symbolic thing where they simply beat the boundary stone.
All right.
But prior to that, it was a punishment for children, and they were beating the bounds, and it was an annual event.
Sounds like fun. Huh? We got to bring it back. Some unruly children.
I don't know, I have to admit, I'm back from Florida, actually, but I'm a Rhode Islander and grew up in Rhode Island, and in fact, I live, my condo is right at Quaker Hill. Anyway, so where am I going with this? I actually wanted to do more ancestry research, so this is, I haven't made the connection exactly, but I must be descended from Jacob, I think.
Could very well be. I mean, first, there were many Jacob Mots. You're going to get so confused when you start looking at all these spots.
Tried to do it online in Florida. Just couldn't do it.
And I know we're running long here tonight, but there is the story of the Portsmouth Indian princess. Endangered. She was taken into the home of a prominent Quaker. The prominent Quaker, they believe, is Giles Slocum. She married John Corey of Corey Farms, and had about 9 or 10 children. Then they ended up moving over to North Kingstown. And I always think if there are some Corey people who do a DNA test and they come up with Native American on Ancestry.com, it could be the Portsmouth princess. And they changed her, the English side, they gave her the name of Elizabeth, so she became Elizabeth Corey. My father's first cousin is descended from her, and she was very disappointed that she didn't have Native American in her DNA because there is a distinct paper trail that goes back in the records. It's kind of urban legend because nobody can really say, but if you Google it, you'll find
It
her.
washes out because somebody descended.
I know.
When she did when I did, that she has some.
So, and I don't mean to cut you off, but it's really getting late, and I wanted to say this. First of all, thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful.
It's a pleasure.